Welcome everyone on this panel on investigating algorithmic systems, and very specifically the panel will be about the concept and idea of algorithm auditing. We have four terrific speakers who I'll quickly introduce. I'm Joris van Hoboken. I'm a professor of law at Vrije Universiteit Brussels and a senior researcher at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. We have four terrific speakers, I would say, on this topic. Very, very expert panel. I will quickly introduce them in the order of the way in which they will speak. And after that they will give opening statements. But we have planned those opening statements to be fairly short, maximum of 5 minutes I've given each of the speakers. So we will have a lot of room for discussion amongst the panelists, of course, but also discussion with the room. So we have Mark Rottenberg, the Executive Director of EPIC, Electronic Privacy Information Center, who's been around for a very, very long time.
Forever.
And we're so happy to have you here. Algorithmic transparency is one of the topics that Mark and EPIC has taken up also over the last 5 years, I would say. Started to campaign on that. Mark and EPIC have done so much work on related topics. I will not tire you with the summary of that. But he will speak first and say something about what EPIC has been doing in the US and give his vision on the question of algorithmic transparency and accountability. So as second speaker we have Professor Bettina Behrendt, who is a professor in the Department of Computer Science of KU Leuven University. And she's an expert in computer science and information retrieval. She will speak second. Then we have Julie Koolsresta.
That's really good.
And who is now at the Hans Bredow Institute of the Hamburg University with a technical background, a PhD in computer science. And then finally we have Michael Veal from the UK, from UCL, from STEEP.
Yeah, sorry.
Science, technology, engineering, and public policy. And Michael is a rising star in the discussions about algorithmic fairness and explainability, and has done some very interesting work also in the public policy context in the UK. So with that, I will give the floor to Mark to give your introduction.
Great. Well, thank you, Joris, and thank you all so much for being here. I really enjoy this particular conference because it's an opportunity to speak openly and candidly about the advocacy work that EPIC is doing. And many conferences I would put together slides, but for this conference I put together a screensaver, which I'm going to pass out to everybody. If we run out, we have a few more. I have some for my co-panelists as well. Now, I need to begin by establishing a little bit of academic credibility. Our organization, EPIC, is made up of many of the leading experts in the US on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues. We have a wonderful advisory board, and among the members of our advisory board are people like Danielle Citron and Frank Pasquale. Now, I don't know if those names are well known to you, but they should be, particularly if you're at this panel, because both Danielle and Frank have helped focus academic attention with, I think, great substance and precision on the problem of the opacity of automated decision-making. Frank wrote a very good book a couple years ago called The Black Box Society. Danielle has published a number of articles, and I've been thinking a lot about their work over the last several years, while I've also been studying data protection law around the world. And one of the conclusions that I came to, we all become data protection experts in our own way and develop expertise around particular subjects or implementations or techniques. I tried to become an expert in what I viewed as the essence of data protection. If you were to get to the core value in data protection, what would you find? And I came to the conclusion that the core value in data protection is accountability over automated decision making. That automated decision making must be transparent, that it must be fair, and that it must occur in the context of the rule of law and democratic institutions. That's my essence of data protection, if you will. Now, the reason that I mention that is because today, of course, artificial intelligence and AI-enabled services, applications, and businesses, this is all hot stuff. You know, if you want to launch a company, you say at the beginning, this is AI-enabled, you know, candy dispenser, right? This is AI-enabled chalkboard eraser. And suddenly things that look familiar are, you know, sexy and interesting, and people pour money into investment. Well, that's their choice. But what I'm trying to do is hook the basic concept at the core of data protection with all this talk about AI today. So let me be precise. About 4 years ago, Epic simply embraced a campaign theme. And we said, what are we going to do to get the public, not just the experts and the academics and the technologists, part of this debate? And we said, we're going to come up with a really cumbersome, awkward slogan. And that cumbersome, awkward slogan will be algorithmic transparency. Now, if you say it enough, it's actually kind of catchy. And if you put it on a screensaver, it can look pretty good. And if you search for it online, you'll find lots and lots of the work that we're doing. But that is actually our expression of an education campaign around algorithmic transparency. What are we doing with algorithmic transparency? Several things. First of all, we are lawyers in the US. It's almost a citizenship requirement, at least if you're living in Washington. You need to be a lawyer. So I wanted to live in Washington, I became a lawyer. We use our legal skills to bring cases against the federal agencies under the Freedom of Information Act. But we don't simply ask for records that we're entitled to under the law. We ask for the processes that determine the outcomes. We are trying to get the techniques, the rules, and the algorithms that reveal how decisions are made about people standing in line at airports, people crossing national borders, people applying for jobs with security requirements. And typically we get two responses. One is, well, this is highly classified, it's national security, we have it, but we can't give it to you. Well, that's what going to law school is for. Because of course that's where we begin our lawsuits, and we have a big debate over, in fact, whether that is restricted as national security. Or they say, oh, it's very complicated. You know, we just put in some names and we get some results, and we have no idea what's happening in between, which is happening, I would argue, in more and more organizations when people are willing to admit. Well, we say that's very interesting too, because if that's what's happening, we really want even more so to understand your decision-making process, because apparently you don't understand your decision-making process. So these are two legal strategies I've just described under open government laws to push back against claims of national security, to push back against complexity. The other argument we push back against is trade secret or proprietary interest. An agency says, well, we'd love to share this with you, of course, but we paid some money to a private contractor, they've developed a technique, and to protect their commercial interests, we can't release it to you. And by the way, we respect that argument. I mean, I think you have to consider that there is commercial value in a proprietary algorithm, but when it makes a judgment about an individual that causes an adverse outcome, then you need to find out how that happened. We've participated as amici, friend of the court in the United States in cases relating to algorithmic-based decisions, and we've begun to draft a law for the United States Congress. We recently met with members of the United States Senate in which we've outlined what we would call the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2018. And it includes a wide variety of provisions, one about the transparency of automated decision-making, two about requirements when data is gathered to provide complete information about how the processes will be deployed, and three, and most interesting, and perhaps you can provide some information on the EU side and then I'll stop, We've recently done more and more work on privacy impact assessments because this national commission created by President Trump sought to collect all the state voter data without conducting a privacy impact assessment. We said as part of our proposed new law going forward, whenever you undertake a privacy impact assessment, in addition to the requirements of saying what data will be collected and how it will be used, we also think a requirement should be to make known the technique by which decisions will occur. I'll stop there, but as you sense, our focus is very much on taking the issue of algorithmic accountability and operationalizing it, producing outcomes in the parliament, in the courts, and with public opinion.
That's great. So let us continue with Bettina. Just one note. If you're interested, and you probably should be, in what Epic is doing, they have a really great website, and there's a lot of links. There's a special page on the work that is being done on algorithmic transparency. It's like a great resource.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joris, for putting me on this panel. And I've been very influenced by Mark, and I owe a great deal to Epic, and I completely share his view that algorithmic transparency is a super important part of where we're trying to go in terms of accountability and data protection. But of course, this is a panel, so I have to be controversial, and I will tell you a few insights from the work, especially on privacy and anti-discrimination in data mining that we've had over the past few years. And my basic point here is algorithmic transparency, algorithmic accountability, algorithmic auditing is all fine and nice, but that's only a part of the big picture, and we should not look too small because we're missing a big part of the problem if we are concentrating on algorithms. So my main point is algorithmic systems are nested in other systems. And so the question is, should we audit these? Do we want to audit these? Can we audit these? And when we do that, can we get beyond we need to look at context and everything is very complex stage? So how can we do this in a rigorous way? And the way that's worked pretty well for us is to have this onion model of saying there is algorithms that are embedded in IT systems that have interfaces most of the time, so that user aspects come in, that these are embedded in information systems where you have rules of a business or other organization, and again this in a wider multi-stakeholder information system such as society and a legal system. And what I want to do is quickly run you through 3 examples of how these onion skins can play out. And I've tried to summarize these as 3 fallacies of assuming something about algorithms and of algorithmic transparency. So there's a lot of research going on at the moment about measuring fairness and measuring other desirable properties. That is really important, but can we assume that one measure of fairness captures what happens to different people? And if we have the same outcome for different minorities, is that actually fairness? In fact, the same thing can affect different people very differently. And I will not go into the discussion now about minorities that are very prominent in the discussion at the moment. But thinking of the advertisements and the political advertisements that we get and that we have had so much discussion about that they're personalized, what do these actually do to people who can't read and write properly? And this is 15% of the population in developed countries. So we're talking about a very big group of people, and we have close to no idea how these are affected by certain personalized offers. So what happens when somebody takes in some information is this first layer. A second layer is that we tend to think of algorithms in isolation, and when they're fair, we're done. But significant decisions, also in the sense of the GDPR, are very rarely fully automatic, as Article 22 would like to have us believe. They are very often semi-automatic, and there is someone or a whole chain of people making decisions on top of the data mining based things, we've run a large-scale experiment in which we showed that the way the interface is designed and the way the task setting is defined totally influences how people deal with even sanitized algorithms, and how there remain traces of discriminatory decision making in those situations. So don't underestimate the IT systems shell and the information systems shell. And the third thing, where we go even further outside in the onion, is that we're making the fallacy that we can think of incentives being very simple and no feedback loops of system dynamics. Well, the thing is, these nested systems produce incentives, and these influences how decisions are being made. So I'm just going to give you one example that I've had a lot of discussions about in the past few weeks. My country, Germany, has instituted a law against hate speech as of 1st January this year. And there was a big discussion there that because this is, in fact, social networks have to take care of deleting hate speech in a fairly short period of time, there would be an incentive to overblock, because if they don't delete stuff that's being reported, then they would get very heavy fines. There was a huge shitstorm on all social media about this is going to lead to overblocking, this is censorship, and so on and so forth. But what happens? As I say, I have been following this discussion very closely and talking to the people who are enforcing that law. What happens? The social networks, of course, they live off the rage economy. They want hate speech. They live off hate speech. So in principle, they have an incentive on this information system layer to underblock. But because they're against this law, it was very tempting in the first days of January to overblock, just to make the case that this law has to go. And so we think that there is this dynamic feedback loop going on here on many different levels, and we're underestimating that, and we shouldn't do that. So this was very much a general overview of how we should not underestimate the system layers that are around the algorithms, and Yui will now go into more specifics of how this could be done.
Yeah, thanks, Bettina. So I thought today I'd talk about, so we keep hearing algorithm auditing. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what different kinds of algorithm auditing systems or techniques there are. And then we can discuss what the pros and cons of each of those are, because there are legal and ethical issues involved with pretty much each one of them. So a lot of this work is from Sandvik and his collaborators from like their 2014 paper. So if somebody is interested in reading in more detail, you can contact me after this. So the first thing that people think about when they think about algorithmic transparency or algorithmic auditing is to say, give me the code and I'll take a look at it. And there are some very obvious problems with that. One being that the code can be pretty complex. It can be evolving over time, but the most difficult part is that the code only makes sense in context, as Bettina already mentioned. So the code without the input data to it makes pretty much no sense, because a lot of times the problem is not that the algorithm developer was malicious and wanted to do something really harmful for the society, but the input data ends up interacting with the algorithm in a way that ends up having societal problems. So the question is, if we were to get the code, how can we do it in a way that is useful? So because there are also issues about, people gaming the system. Once you know how it works, people who have incentives to game or manipulate the system, they would try their best to do that. And there are proposals for, having trusted third parties who are doing the auditing. The second way that people have proposed to do audits is to ask the users. They say, okay, you want to know how Facebook is, algorithmically changing your newsfeed or what it's showing, go just ask the people, what did you see? And the advantage of that is that you can also get an estimate of how people are reacting to the algorithm or what they think about the algorithm. But of course, this is really hard to scale, and there are always problems of recall and self-reporting in this case. People don't want to tell things that that they feel uncomfortable about or which are societally sort of looked down upon. The third way, which is the typical way that many of the computer science researchers do these kind of algorithm auditing studies, is to scrape everything. What that means is that you create a program that interacts with the platform. So for example, we did a study where we were trying to see if there was some sort of search bias on social media as well as on the web. So you can create programs that repeatedly query the platform. So let's say Twitter search. And then you could get this data and try and look at the data to understand if there is some bias that's being introduced. I'll come back to this study a little bit later at the end of my 5 minutes. The problem with this kind of studies is that it typically violates the terms of service. And especially in the US, this is a really big deal because the CFAA, so the computer...
Fraud and abuse.
Yeah, exactly. This makes it really hard for researchers to do this kind of research, which would actually tell us what is happening empirically or in the wild, right? And in fact, right now, ACLU, I think, has filed a lawsuit on behalf of researchers and journalists saying that we should be allowed to do these kind of audit studies. So maybe we can talk a bit more about this, especially because it's also becoming an issue in terms of publishing your research. A lot of venues are refusing to accept papers which have used this methodology. And I think that's, for the society and for research, that's dangerous because it really takes away some of the kind of things that we could infer about these algorithms then. The fourth one is called sock puppets, which is an internet slang, which basically means you create multiple accounts which are manipulated or controlled by one single entity, in this case the researchers, and then you probe the system. So you could go and create Google accounts or Facebook accounts, and then you try and see how the algorithm on Facebook is giving information to these sock puppet accounts. And the issue that comes up, which is, I'm not sure if it is a legal issue, but definitely an ethical issue, is that you're intervening in this platform's functioning. So people who are there, they are seeing what you're doing. Plus the platform is also being changed slightly by whatever data you're injecting into this system now. And it's still an open question. How do you figure out what is the minimum amount of intervention that you can do to get the maximum amount of inference about the algorithm? And the last kind that I'd like to talk about are collaborative audits. And in the previous panel session, this was brought up in brief. And the idea here is that we ask users, hey, can you give us your data? Or can you install this browser plugin which makes some queries on your behalf and just sends us that data? And there are some successful examples of this, one of which is the algorithmwatch.org. This is a system built by a German professor, Katharina Zweig, and there people have contributed their search histories. And this gets rid of the ethical problem because here real users are making these queries, so the terms of services are not violated. You're not injecting extra data that is harming the platform or affecting the other users. So these are the 5 main ways of doing the algorithm audits. And the thing to keep in mind while deciding which one you want to go for is also what your aim is. So one aim could be transparency, that you really want to understand how exactly the algorithm is working. Or your aim could be accountability. Who is responsible for whatever adverse effect that you end up observing at the end? Or it could be explainability. You just want to make sure that the people can understand why they are being shown certain things. And there are examples of each of these being implemented both by the industry as well as some research that has been done to promote these kind of aims, right? And I'd like to just briefly end with a study that we performed where we wanted to see the bias, the search engine bias effectively. Until now, most of the studies which were done for web searches, and the assumption was that the algorithm is the bad guy. It is doing everything, and the bias that you see is only because of the algorithm. And we also started with the same assumption, but we stumbled upon the fact that it's not just the algorithm. So imagine you go on Twitter, on Facebook, you want to search about whatever is happening. So CPDP, for instance, you go search for it. The Facebook or Twitter internally gets all the data that is relevant to CPDP. So like all the tweets containing #CPDP, for instance. And then there is a ranking algorithm, which is developed by Twitter, which decides what is more important than the other. And then that search results are shown to the end user. So that is what would be shown to me. And the advantage that we had in this scenario was that not only could we observe these end results that were shown to the users, but we could also collect what was the data that was being ranked. So we could collect all the tweets containing these query terms, so CPDP, for instance. And by comparing these two things, the output that is shown to the user and the input that went into the ranking algorithm, you can make estimates about how much of the bias that is shown to the end user is because of the ranking algorithm that we don't know anything about, and how much is it because of the input data. So if everybody went on Twitter right now and just ended up saying great things about CPDP, you would never see anything that is adversely, like that's negative about CPDP. And that's not because Twitter is choosing to side with CPDP and only show good things, but it's because the data doesn't have any of the negative things. And it's important to separate out these different sources, because if the majority of the bias is coming from the ranking algorithm, the platform provider is to blame. Whereas if a lot of the bias is coming from the input data, these are basically the users on this platform. So who's responsible or who's accountable ends up changing. And I'd be happy to discuss more issues related to this if you have any questions. But now I'd like to pass on to Michael.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. So, I mean, as has been emphasized here, but as we don't really need to say very much, software really matters. And software is always often mattered in decision-making processes and constraining them, enabling new ones, shaping them, from, as Bettina said, user interfaces onto models and analytical models, the way that we quantify the world, the way we understand it. So one of the core things that we come to when we talk about auditing is making these transparent to somebody. And there are actually many sources for this kind of transparency, at least taking the UK legal context into account. So one of them is the GDPR, data protection. In certain cases, they provides broad amounts of accountability under the new principle, but also the transparency principle, and more specifically around automated decisions that have been talked about. These specific, quite narrow, significant automated decisions, of which there aren't really very many that fall under this category. They're fully automated and fully and significant with an equivalence to a legal effect. So, but that's only one real domain. If we think about one thing that's caused a lot of outrage in this, especially from US war stories, algorithmic war stories we've seen, public sector decisions in the justice and policing sector, which aren't really covered by GDPR. I mean, often policing will fall into the law enforcement directive, which doesn't have meaningful logic of explanation or anything like recital 71 that's present. But there are other sources for transparency there. Freedom of information obliges people not to procure things that are too opaque, and that's what you see by talking to civil servants. The public sector equality duty, an active way of ensuring that systems aren't being discriminatory, a legal obligation to actively promote anti-discrimination rather than just mitigate discrimination. You'll see in a few months probably coming out the UK government data science ethical framework, basically the second version, which is much, much longer if anyone's seen the first one, which contains a lot of guidance on you really shouldn't be making black boxes to use for decision support within the public sector. And this is going to be codified in a more formal way, even if it's not a legally binding text. Also different sectoral regulations. So this kind of is a context where actually a lot of the time public sector black boxes are quite hard to build, which is great. So there's a sort of legal framework that we're building on. However, what do we mean by transparency? Because we don't have a black box system maybe being used in a really high stakes environment, if we've assured that it's possible to analyze it at least, who are we being transparent to? So these individual rights paradigms that we see within data protection assume that people want transparency for particular decisions that are made about them. Now, this might be great at catching smoking guns. If you've got really severely entrenched racism or discrimination against another group of people, you might notice that the system is behaving badly based on a series of individual queries. However, many of the things that we're discovering, especially related to, say, text analysis, really analysis of high-dimensional data, internet fingerprinting, and so on, are not problems which you could statistically discover from a single query, or even just from a few single queries. So in this case, statistically, individual rights paradigms fail to do anything useful in that context, let alone when we consider the history of individual transparency rights and their real lack of use in data protection law. People have often found this burdensome. People have not made subject access requests, even though they've had the legal right to do so across Europe since 1995. It's mostly been journalists, people going to tribunal. So there's a bit of what we call the transparency fallacy in some work I've been doing, which is we don't want to aim at individual rights. We have to think about who we are being transparent to. It's useful to have these individual rights because they assure that systems are going to be made transparently. But we can't expect them to solve the problems that we identify. So we're thinking about aggregate outcomes, discrimination, monitoring and evaluation, effectiveness over a longer period of time, what works. In the UK, we have a lot of what works centres in the public sector, which try to gather evidence on whether something works in the policing context or in the educational context. So these aggregate forms of transparency, what would that look like in relation to, say, civil society? Article 80 of the GDPR provides some sort of group collective rights, but it doesn't provide any rights of investigation for anyone who uses these rights to bring a complaint on someone else's behalf, or if it's triggered by member states on behalf of somebody who's never authorized that complaint to be made. On behalf of a group, for example. In the UK, we call this a super complaint, when we have that in other sections of law. So it's a format, but it doesn't provide special powers. Model repositories. Perhaps for certain sectors, people have to deposit high-stakes models in areas like libraries. Releasing them publicly could work, like the open data movement. It could provide some levels of transparency, but we worry about gaming. We also worry about these systems leaking personal data or being used to profile people very quickly. So, all in all, we get a landscape which it's quite tricky, but we do definitely need actors who can analyze models, have the legal ability to go in there or to receive them from somewhere else, to scrutinize them. And that's a capacity we don't really have, even if we had the legal rights right now. Even if there were legal rights for civil society organizations to do that, where is the funding coming from? Where is the expertise coming from? How is that being retained? What are the career paths of these people? Who are these socially engaged technologists? And why should people want to become one? And I think in the future we've got to do a lot more formalization of that from a civil society point of view, while equally working on the legal rights to do that and to make it useful.
That's great. So circling also back to the role of civil society, I want to kick off with one kind of general question and then give it to the audience, because like I was recently working on a proposal, a big proposal for a lot of PhD students on algorithmic monitoring, and the idea of algorithmic auditing, and the idea is there's going to be this new profession of people that are auditing algorithms, and this involves some of the people that have in computer science that have been doing a lot of work on this topic, but their imagination of where this auditing is going to take place is actually in the organizations developing and deploying the algorithms. So in contrast to that, I think what I've heard mostly from the speakers today, Bettina perhaps a bit less because she stayed more on the conceptual level of thinking about the problem, is this idea of doing research or finding out things from the outside, which is the situation that you often find yourself in as a civil society actor. I want to ask the question of how does this look from the inside? And maybe that can be also connected to what Mark said earlier about there is some connection here to the privacy impact assessment, to the data protection impact assessment, which is an exercise that the controller is supposed to do. No, it's not something that is happening from the outside. So what does this algorithmic auditing look like when you think about it, okay, as a starting point? That has to happen in the organization that is responsible for deploying the algorithm, or the company, the software company that is developing the algorithm, and they get deployed in the real world. Is that going to be the main? Is that going to be the main activity of algorithmic auditing and monitoring, or is it like? And what is the value of having this outside perspective, like to have this robust outside perspective as well? Maybe in like, I would like maybe I'd like to hear from everybody.
So just a quick answer. On the inside, as I said, we already have a proposal, which is to make the algorithmic auditing part of the privacy impact assessment. And since we have a well-developed profession and it's growing with the GDPR, we actually think that's a very natural way to get to the issue. And frankly, I think organizations have a self-interest in doing this, you see, because as these systems become more complex, their ability to determine how outputs are produced have been diminished. So this is not an area where I think companies necessarily get, dragged kicking and screaming. But I want to make one further point on this, and to Michael's remark about gaming, which we haven't talked about, and this is from the outside. This is the reason that I'm very much in favor of transparency as opposed to testing, right? So you talked about putting in data and seeing outcomes. We've just had the experience with very expert regulators, the EPA in the United States testing vehicles from VW for emissions. That software was designed to reduce the emission output during the testing period. And when the testing period was over, the emission output went up to improve fuel economy, okay? And it's very important to understand where that happened. That was with a sophisticated regulator. The same thing, by the way, happened with Uber. Uber escaped regulatory oversight by very sophisticated gaming of public officials who were responsible for managing transportation services. So I think all of these proposals that are predicated on, well, transparency is too complex, too difficult, let's put in data and see results. If you're a regulator on the outside, I would shake my head. Not sufficient.
Do you want to react also?
Yeah. No, I mean, quite in addition to that, I think even if the insight is benevolent, and let's assume they often are, there is the blindness that comes from having developed something yourself or having developed the context in which this is going to generate value for you and your colleagues, and you just don't see all the dependencies. So, let me just make one example here, and the point is, of course, underlining Michael's point, for example, that we really need an interdisciplinary working together on these issues. So at the moment, in the context of privacy impact assessments, there is a lot of very fine-grained looking at the risk of de-anonymization in certain data sets. And I think that's great. And you get into a more differentiated analysis of which stakeholders could be more at risk of being de-anonymized. But that risk in itself is very different for different kinds of people. And we forget that if we have developed an algorithm where some individual is either anonymous or not anonymous and doesn't have any further properties like a human being. And we need other disciplines to tell us that thing. And there is all that research, and there is a lot of great research going on, and there's a lot of great collaboration going on in outside research as well. But that really has to be fostered, because only then can we get to this rigor of really testing everything that we forget when we just come from one place.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll say something. We risk in our different countries have very different environments for, say, a public sector organisation. I'm going to deal public sector, not deal with private sector, because I think it's different internally auditing with a business logic compared to a public sector logic. So in the UK, we have actually many fewer internal proprietary models than, say, the US does, that we've seen reported anyway. And it's the same in Europe, actually, in several European countries. Not everywhere, but in several European countries. When you have quite a large, high-capacity, centralized part of the public sector, you don't necessarily need to procure very widely. If you've got a large police department, you can get an in-house modeler who works with a visual programming language, building a model that can be exported and analyzed in quite a varied number of ways. If you're a tiny police department, like many in the US are, you have very little option but to procure a pre-packaged amount of software if there's nothing provided for you by centrally. And so this proprietary notion can be really hard to deal with from that point of view. So there is guidance. I mean, there's ongoing guidance. It's going to be published soon from the UK about how you procure for auditability in relation to fairness and transparency and so on. But I think that's something we have to get to grips with. Another area which is very linked when you do have in-house modelers, and they're actually building models based on public sector data, for example, there's a usual underemphasis on the what some people call technical debt, but in general is this idea of maintenance. So these people are often said, oh, could you model this phenomena for us? And they go, yeah, okay, I can do that, model it. And oh, great, can you do this other one? And yeah, okay. And they have to then also maintain these models they've set up, and no one's being hired to maintain, because it's not a sexy job. No one wants to hire anyone to maintain a system. So these people who are initially are usually quite turned on to issues like transparency and fairness, if you chat to them, they don't have the capacity to do it anymore. They get completely burdened. So I think we have to wonder what separation of roles we get inside organizations. Otherwise, we can have the best intentions, and organizations can have the best intentions, but misunderstand how that gets translated.
Yeah, I don't have anything specifically extra to add, so maybe we can.
Yeah, let's go to the audience. Questions. Chris?
I have a question which is based around what we do in regulatory stuff. There's a really fascinating article that Mark published yesterday with Larry Irving. And I'll just give one quote which it's the nicest thing I've read this year. He's cringing because he knows that we're in a group of people who might take this either way. Progressives gave up on democratic institutions and the rule of law. A new mantra of multi-stakeholder engagement took hold. The fox didn't just guard their hen house, it designed it and wired it to the internet with 24/7 surveillance. The chickens never had a chance. So here we are, the chickens NGOs, to discuss these things. And I just wonder, because when Michael talks about how can we do things in the UK, most of the funding will be taken, for better or worse, in Europe. We take much of our research funding that could apply in this area from government, one way or another. Sort of as a sneak under the radar. We're not actually going to have a centre for regulation of AI in the UK. We're going to have a centre for AI ethics and innovation.
Data ethics innovation.
That's right, data ethics innovation. Thank you. It's actually even broader. Because we don't like to use the word regulation. And so thank you for introducing us to the word the phrase rule of law in these things. Are you worried that we're still pussyfooting around this area and sort of talking about forms of well-meaning non-profits trying to analyze AI as opposed to actually the rule of law putting that?
Well, let me first say, the reason I cringed is because this article just appeared. It's about the most radical thing I've written forever. And I wasn't even sure if it was going to be published. And when I had the sense it wasn't going to be published, my thought was, I'm okay with that too. But now that it's out there, I'm okay with that too. And it is very much a response to what happened in the US over the last 25 years as the internet industry took hold of internet policy. And I think it's worth looking at. Now, I think it is also a US story. And one of the reasons as a privacy researcher and part-time academic, I so much enjoy coming to conferences in Brussels and other parts of the world. I don't have that deep sense of foreboding here that I do about the US. And I think part of it is that simple things like rule of law and respect for democratic institutions aren't really in doubt here. I mean, you have frictions, as you should, by the way, in political systems. But what we have happening right now in the US is actually something different, and it's quite troubling. I don't want to vary too far from the panel discussion, and I know you have other questions, but Chris, just to come back to your point, part of what we're trying to do with EPIC through this campaign is drive these important policy issues through democratic institutions and through rule of law, respecting that people will have different views and there will be debate, and all that's fine. What we refuse to do is participate in multi-stakeholder proceedings or act as a focus group for some big company that simply wants to improve its messaging to the public by listening to a few articulate NGOs. And they say, oh, if we say stuff like we care about data protection and we value privacy and transparency, we'll be good. That's what we've rejected. So this is a campaign that is intended not only to seek the endpoint of algorithmic accountability, but to do so through democratic institutions.
So when you hear words like
other-
ethics and innovation instead of regulation.
Well, I mean, yeah. So, like, yeah, clear. And I think that's very. I think that really relates to the topic. You know, like that question of like, shouldn't we just regulate these things? And we see a lot of work on ethics in relation to algorithms, which is another way to decontextualize. I think from the regulatory issues. You know, you present it as some kind of like ideal type phenomenon. What is it like with the cars and the trolleys and all these kind of problems that you could do in ethics? And there's nothing against doing these kind of exercises in ethics, but systems have a context and there's something at stake in terms of like for the people and the people that work in organizations that deploy them. Let's take another question from, if there are there more questions? There must be. Yeah.
Well, if nobody else than me, I may have missed the point. We're talking about AI and about algorithm. Well, we have casual kind of neural networks where, yes, we have learning algorithms, and yes, we have algorithms to produce a result. But are those the algorithms we want to test? Because if you want to measure a neural network, this is similar to the brain of a person. What can be the measurement? What are you looking for? Or are those algorithmic measurements only for vector machines or something like that?
Great question.
We've had systems for extraction of rules in neural networks. It's been a research area for 30, 40 years. And so, I mean, this is not, it's often a bit of, I think it's a bit of an industry myth that's being peddled. The real problem is when you've got high dimensional data, when you've got a lot of variables that are not humanly understandable and you've got thousands of them and they're combined in ways that are confusing. But that's often a problem of, basically it's a feature of your problem that you're trying to tackle, less the analytics, I would say, is the biggest challenge.
Where the problems are, if we want to do data analysis and we can solve it with logic, we do not need those AI.
Oh yeah, often it's a problem. Just you're asking the wrong question. If you want to solve this societal problem, the answer is not a neural network. Yeah, that's fair enough.
But
Are there other reactions? Maybe?
yeah, I mean that's a huge area. They kind of how can we make algorithms or learning algorithms understandable, interpretable, and transparent, and all these other words. And I think we're only at the beginning there, because so far we're seldom even asking, does it make sense to a human, and to which human?
That's a big one.
And and I don't know, I have the feeling in this room stakeholder has become a dirty word. So
That's my fault.
okay. I just want to say, when I say multiple stakeholders, I mean multiple different people and stakeholders in a democratic society under the rule of law.
Well said.
Right, but I mean, I think this is really what this is about. Like, if transparency is one of the goals we have, and I think transparency is one of the goals, it is in line with accountability, and it's not the same thing, but it's an important component. Then what does that mean? And what does that mean to whom? And how can we find out? And all of these things are big research areas, but there's nothing we can do but do it, right?
Will it mean in the end that we should ban this kind of AI, which cannot be put into a comprehensive mode, into a rule set by what we can do?
I can make you a really complicated logistic regression if you want.
Yeah.
So then this is the question. I think that was the opening panel of CPDP last year that I had the pleasure of being on that panel, actually, with Mark and with Krishna Gumadi and some others. And of course that's a really big question. If you cannot explain the system, are there maybe certain situations that you're not allowed to use that system for particular purposes? And that's it. That's a very it's a big debate. I want to pass on to I see some other hands. Yep, please.
Thank you.
And I'm going to now repeat the question because, like, for the video, I've been asked to do that, and I forgot.
I have small comments for the person. Please start with Tina. Considering the limits in algorithmic audit, do you think that those limits, those bias, are in the auditor or in the algorithmic auditing itself? Because to me, it seems that the limited offline are on the auditor. And if we make an audit, it's more collaborative, maybe they get absorbed.
Okay, so this is a question for Bettina for how to deal with, like, how can you broaden that context by involving more people in doing the audit and just extending the scope of that? Would that be the solution? Yeah.
I think that's what I'm trying to argue, and I don't think we really have good procedures for that yet. And
I'm
we
working
need.
on it.
Hmm?
I'm working on it.
That's perfect. So we need to talk.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
And then another
Yeah.
comment.
And could you say a little bit then, how do you do that and what is the context in which you do that?
Oh, thank you. Collaboratively, like with the tool, a similar tool explained by the lady on the left, volunteers are scraping their own Facebook timeline to permit a collaborative analysis of the Facebook algorithm. But we cannot let the database accessible to anybody, because that can also permit some personal information. No? So we're working on a framework that can guarantee some ethically preserving analysis. You can, for example, do analysis that want to inquire over phenomena, but not over user behavior. This is the best discrimination I found. If you can do an algorithm that use as ID, so the analysis is around this concept. And this concept is not a person, but a topic. You can extract results that are fully anonymous. That in theory can permit a more collaborative judgment of what is happening. Also, other level of ethical agreement can be done. If you accept certain kind of ethical constraint, you can access the database. But I've not yet defined those points. Can be follow up.
And this is an academic research project?
Technically, yes, and we work with the University of Amsterdam for it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
If I may add,
Yeah.
the University of Amsterdam actually is doing really good work in this area of collaboratively trying to solve societal problems. So even in their, I forget the exact department, but media-related people. Yeah. So so they have. So the basic idea is you develop some sort of a browser plugin that people who are interested in helping scientists solve some problems can download, and then that browser plugin, just whenever you're normally using your computer, takes some of the data and sends it back to the scientists. That's the basic idea, and this is being done in Amsterdam for multiple, and it seems you're also doing it, and there are multiple other universities who are doing it.
I think this is the project led by Professor Natalie Hellberg.
Exactly.
Personalized communications, but there's a data
Robin, I
active
think,
project by Stefania Milan and
Yeah.
others.
Yeah,
sure.
We could ask the companies to give us the data without having to scrape it in a really weird, non-representative way.
I don't trust the API. I want to really
Not the API. Legally, you can legally oblige them to do this. I mean, I'm just thinking that we get stuck in this kind of Twitter has said that API is not representative. I know what you mean. We're trying to collect data, but it doesn't have to be this much effort. In theory, is just a point maybe to make. The other thing is it's consensus conferences in Denmark. Technology assessment has a really big history. Participatory technology assessment, consensus conferences where you get experts in for several days, members of the public, educate about a particular technological phenomena, and people deliberate over what they think about it, is a really useful tool that is also underused in this area.
Thanks for that. Cassia, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so quick point in response to what you just said. I think that's a very long way legally
maybe.
obliged to give all the input for every user taking part into our experiment. We need 2 years to fight for data from 2 years back. I think still doing this in a tech hacking way is probably faster.
I'm not saying do it now. I'm just saying we could think about. People don't really mention that as a possibility, very much. Like Chris was saying, like regulation is a dirty word.
Right. I mean, last session we discussed how to use it. I don't think we but okay. I wanted to get back to 2 points that you made before. One on the who should do the auditing. When I discussed the problem with some people from the banking sector, they made me aware of the fact that at least in Poland, apparently the Financial Supervisory Authority is auditing algorithms used for credit scoring. It can be true also for stock markets. So maybe just a quick overview of your opinions. Do you know any authorities anywhere in the world who did a good job on that, and how can we check the results of those audits apparently being done in, for example, financial world? I wasn't aware of this, so I never looked into this myself. And second issue, you mentioned, started discussing already what should be the subject of the audit. Can we imagine for a second the perfect result of the audit? How can you imagine how such a report, or I mean, basically, what should it be? Is it a graph, or is it Excel sheet, or is it a report?
It's just a big tick, I think.
What is it?
The first one, yeah,
Score.
credit score and financial scoring has a really big, detailed legal history. I'm not sure they've always been auditing for the questions we're concerned about today. Some areas, certain types of fairness, certain types of discrimination, for example. But there are a lot of sectoral regulations, medical regulation is another one, which are pretty well developed, and we can definitely build on that.